nice to have an audience like this. You all seem to be intellectually bright, and I'm very glad that you have agreed to listen to people who probably are not as enlightened and clever as you look. When I was given the choice of subjects, I selected the topic of hunger. Not a very pleasant subject to talk about, but I think amongst all the subjects that were proposed for this evening, I thought that that was the most relevant and the one speaking about which requires that quality of character for which I am slightly notorious. Ladies and gentlemen, there is widespread hunger in this country. We are not even sure about the extent. The estimates of hungry people supposed to live below the poverty line varies from 27% to 78%. They have different methods of evaluation. But that there should be this kind of a difference of estimates is itself a little disconcerting. If experts are in such tremendous disagreement, it may be that even the highest figure of 78 is wrong, maybe something more. But ladies and gentlemen, you don't have to waste your time on making these statistical exercises. You see the appalling figure, the appalling face of hunger, poverty, and all that goes with both these prominent features of a great section of our population. What is amazing is that ever since India became independent, promises and scores of commitments have been made by every government, by every politician who comes into power, and yet it is strange that the number of hungry and malnutritional persons continues to rise. And it is tragic as well as callous that in spite of the ample availability of food in the whole world, the amount of food that the world produces, if it was fairly distributed, there will not be a single hungry mouth. So therefore, ladies and gentlemen, the first cause of hunger, wherever you spot it, is the maldistribution of our international assets. Of course, globalization is now becoming a solvent of that problem to some extent. But be sure that even with globalization, you are not getting a free share of what is lying to be distributed, but is not distributed. So, ladies and gentlemen, think of what accompanies hunger and malnutrition. Disease, epidemics, early deaths, rise of crime, terrorism, because the most copious source of recruitment for terrorists is the hungry, unemployed chap who has nothing better to do except to take a gun ultimately and shoot down innocent people. Then the degradation of environment, that itself is a direct result of hunger and malnutrition. The worst part is what happens to children. Ladies and gentlemen, there have been estimates that young children of both genders take to prostitution. And prostitution for them is the real promotion to a somewhat more prosperous and a less hungry life. So poverty, ladies and gentlemen, is a degrading disease. Take another kind of poverty which goes with the kind of poverty that you are thinking about. There is the poverty of energy. Again, another estimate, but a very reliable estimate, that 50% of the urban population, even in this India, has no access to any electricity grid. This number is an appalling 90% in the rural population. Take one consequence of an absence of electricity and electric power. You then have the open fires in the kitchen. These open fires emit smoke. This smoke itself is the cause of death. And ladies and gentlemen, the estimate is that about 1.6 million persons die because of the inhalation of the smoke which comes from these open fires and which is the lack of access to any electricity grid. So ladies and gentlemen, disease and disease in its worst form and early deaths are the consequence of the hunger that we are facing. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I sound very pessimistic when I have told you all these things, but I want to share some good news with you as well. The good news is that India is really not a poor country. We are poor because we are corrupt. And this requires to be said, and it requires to be said from the housetops, not by one person, but as many persons as can be summoned to this cause. I don't know how many of you understand Urdu. It's a very famous thing. कि सितम के दौर में वो अहले दिल ही काम आए, ज़बां पे नाज था जिनको वो बेज़बां निकले. There are people who are proud of their eloquence, but they become tongue-tied when they have to speak the inconvenient truth. And that is the problem in this country which we are facing, which we have faced for a very long time. And ladies and gentlemen, the problem therefore continues to become more and more intense, more and more capable of spreading greater horror than it has so far. But ladies and gentlemen, now look at this corruption business. I must compliment the United Nations for having taken up this matter. In 2005, the United Nations, thanks to the United Nations agencies and the World Bank together in unison, they produced a convention against corruption. This convention against corruption, ladies and gentlemen, has the primary object of stolen assets recovery. Why? Why have they busied themselves with creating a mechanism for the recovery of stolen property? I would like every one of you to get charge of this report of the United Nations. It's a fantastic document to read. You will be ashamed of it also when you are reading it. But, ladies and gentlemen, that feeling of shame, I think, is a shame which must arise in every human heart. I want to read to you from the executive summary of this document, which I have been able to secure. There are 2 paragraphs in this which I wish to read to you. The theft of public assets from developing countries is a huge and serious problem. The cross-border flow of the global proceeds from criminal activities, corruption and tax evasion is estimated at between 1 trillion and 1.6 trillion per year. Please calculate this, translate this into Indian rupees, and you will have some kind of an explosion here. You won't be able to calculate the figure in the first place. So, ladies and gentlemen, these estimates may be slightly imprecise, maybe a little less, maybe a little more, but even if they are anywhere in the neighborhood, I think the amount is just too colossal. Assets stolen by corrupt leaders at the country level are frequently of staggering magnitude. The true cost of corruption far exceeds the value of assets stolen by the leaders of the countries. This would include the degradation of public institutions, especially those involved in public finance management and financial sector governance, the weakening, if not the distribution of the private investment climate, and the corruption of social service delivery mechanisms for basic health and education programs, with a particularly adverse effect upon the poor of the country. The collateral damage in terms of foregone growth and poverty